Hey, so in this video I want to talk about why and how I learnt Korean. I can actually speak Korean. It's nowhere near as good as my Japanese is, but I can have basic, simple conversations. And it all started when I had this online Japanese girlfriend, and she was really into Korean culture and the language and the music. So to try and impress her, I decided to learn some basic Korean and learn how to read the Korean alphabet, which only took me about a week to learn the Korean alphabet. It's actually pretty simple once you get the hang of it. And I learned a few basic phrases, and that was about it. And I kind of gave up after a few weeks. So fast forward a few months later, I decided to go to Japan to meet her. And things didn't go too well. After about 4 to 5 weeks, we broke up. And I was in this guest house in Japan, and I was really shy and nervous. For the first 4 or 5 weeks, I didn't speak to anyone at the guest house. I just sat by myself. I ate all my meals on my own. During the day, I used to go to this shopping center and just sit there doing nothing, staring at people walking past. I was really disappointed because I had this stupid idea that I would go to Japan and I would spend every day with this girl that I met online, but things didn't turn out that way. She was very busy with university and looking for jobs, and we could only meet up maybe 2 days a week. So I was feeling really lonely and depressed, and then about 4 to 5 weeks later, people started to approach me and started to talk to me. And around that time, two new Asian women came into the guest house, and they were actually from Korea. And I think they kind of pitied me because they started to invite me to go out with them when they went sightseeing, and they started to eat meals with me. And then after about a few weeks of this, I actually slept with one of them, and we kind of became a couple. We didn't really make it public. We kind of tried to hide the facts that we were sleeping together. But I'm pretty sure everyone knew. It was kind of obvious. I felt a bit awkward about it because she was so much older than me. She was about 15 years older than me. And honestly speaking, I felt a bit embarrassed. Anyway, there were quite a few other Korean people in the guest house, and we all kind of stuck together. The Koreans were like in this Korean group, the Japanese were in this Japanese group, and all the foreigners were like in this foreigner group. There's like separate groups in the guest house. And since I was in a relationship with one of the Korean people, I was automatically accepted into the Korean group. So I ate all my meals with the Korean people. I did all my sightseeing and excursions with the Korean people. And I really enjoyed it. I felt like I was part of a family. I really felt accepted by them. And I started to get a bit frustrated because they were always speaking in Korean and I didn't understand what they were saying. And there was this one Korean guy that I really didn't like because he was really talkative and chatty. And every time he was there, he would start talking to my girlfriend for a really long time. And I used to get really jealous and kind of irritated. And I started to develop this hatred for him because he would like hog all of the attention from my girlfriend. And I used to get really paranoid and worried that they were talking about something sexual. So I decided to start learning Korean. I went to the bookshop. I bought loads of how to learn Korean books. But the thing is, because I was in Japan, all of the books were in Japanese. They weren't in English. They were for Japanese people who wanted to learn Korean. So I had to learn Korean entirely in Japanese. And I actually think this worked out better because Korean is a lot closer to Japanese than it is to English. Korean and Japanese are very similar in my opinion. The grammar is pretty much almost identical. A lot of words have the same or very similar pronunciations. So I think that the best way to learn Korean is to first learn Japanese and then learn Korean in Japanese. If you know Japanese, then it's going to be really easy for you to learn Korean. I think Korean is basically the same language as Japanese, except for the words are different. After about a few months of studying Korean, we stopped talking in Japanese. Her Japanese was pretty bad, so it was a lot easier to speak to her in Korean. And we started speaking entirely in Korean. My Korean was still pretty bad, but it was starting to get better than her Japanese, so it made sense to speak in Korean instead. Anyway, after about a few months, she had to go back to Korea, and I think that was the most depressing day in my whole life. I went from this stage of being alone in the guest house to finally finding people that I felt accepted by, all the Korean people, and then after my girlfriend and her friend went back to Korea, I felt like I was alone again. I stopped going down to the living room. I started to stay in my room all day just learning Korean. I remember the day she went back to the ferry port to go back to Korea, and she went back on the ferry. After I came back to the guest house, I went up to the roof of the guest house and I just started crying. I cried for like 20 minutes. I was so upset. I felt so lost and alone. And at that time, I was actually attending this Japanese language school. And after she left and went back to Korea, I felt so depressed. I just stopped going to the school completely. I went maybe 1 day a week. I didn't even attend the final day at school to get my graduation certificate, so I guess I didn't actually finish the course. My dad wasn't very happy about it because he paid for it and I didn't even finish the course. She actually came back to Japan just to see me, which was really nice of her. I ended up leaving the guest house without saying goodbye to anyone. I just left and I met up with her and we went to stay in a hotel and we spent my last 2 weeks in Japan together, which I really enjoyed. I remember my very last day in Japan, we went to the airport together and we were just hugging and crying in the airport in front of everyone. It was kind of pathetic. We were so upset, it felt like we were never going to see each other ever again. We actually ended up meeting another 5 or 6 times over the course of 5 years. Every time I went to Korea, I stayed with her for 3 months at a time, and I've been to Korea 4 times now. And the last time I saw her was last year in Tokyo, just before I left. I'm not sure if I'm going to see her again now that I have a girlfriend. Everyone in the guest house thought it was pretty funny that I was learning Korean in Japan because most foreigners come to Japan to learn Japanese and all the other foreigners in the guest house were sitting there with their Japanese textbooks and I was this British guy sitting there learning Korean in Japanese in Japan. They kept saying to me, why didn't you just go to Korea? I never really intended or planned on learning Korean properly like I did. It just kind of happened. Fucking hell. It just kind of happened. I never had any interest in Korea, K-pop, K-drama, or Korean culture before that. I tried watching Korean drama a few times, but I could never get into it. There was just way too much shouting and screaming and yelling, and it just gave me a headache every time I tried watching it. Korean is a very aggressive sounding language, in my opinion. It sounds like they're having an argument, even though they're just having a normal conversation. I used to be really into Korean music, but not the regular stuff that people seem to be into nowadays, like K-pop. I can't stand K-pop. I don't like pop music in general. I used to be really into these rock bands from the 70s and the 80s. I used to have hundreds and hundreds of really old Korean songs from the 70s, 80s, 90s on my phone. I used to really love Korean food as well. I loved kimchi. I used to have it with almost everything. Even when I came back to the UK, I started ordering kimchi off websites and I used to eat it at home. But my dad used to complain because it had such a strong smell. Even if you put it in a container, the smell would leak out and just get everywhere. So I had to stop eating kimchi because my dad kept moaning about it. My favourite food when I go to Japan is actually Korean barbecue. It's so good. You get this big green leaf, I think it's called lettuce, and then you put all this stuff in it like pork and kimchi and garlic and onions, and then you wrap it all up in the lettuce and then you put it in your mouth and you chew it and it tastes delicious. When I used to go to karaoke in Japan, I used to sing these really old Korean songs all the time. And there was this one time I went to karaoke with a bunch of people from the guest house and the guest house manager. And I think the manager kind of got fed up. And when I was singing this Korean song, he just cancelled the song whilst I was singing it. He said it was really boring. And I got really angry and I just left. I went home. Now that I think about it, I guess it was pretty boring. Karaoke is really boring if the other people are just singing all these songs that you've never heard of. This is the reason why I prefer going to karaoke by myself, because you don't have to worry about other people. When I was going to that Japanese language school, I used to have lots of Taiwanese friends and we went to karaoke once and it was so boring. They just sung Chinese songs the whole time and I had never heard of any of those songs and I was just sitting there waiting for my turn. And if you go to karaoke with a large group of people, you hardly get to sing. You get to sing maybe twice an hour, and then you're just sitting there for the rest of the time, waiting for your turn, listening to other people sing songs that you've never even heard of. And then when it gets your turn to sing, no one's even listening anyway. They're just chatting and talking or trying to decide what they want to sing for their turn.